All right, everybody. Hello, and welcome to another interview with an author. Today we have Sean Campbell, everybody. And, everybody, just calm down. We got a live studio audience here. All right, so Sean, tell me a little bit about yourself.
So I'm a crime novelist. I've been writing since 2012. A decade ago, on St. Patrick's Day, someone bet me I couldn't write a book, and I'm incredibly competitive. So I said, I didn't say I'd do it. I said I could do it in 90 days or less, thinking that was a ridiculously quick time frame. 23 days later, I had my first manuscript. Not necessarily in great shape, admittedly. When you write 80,000 words in 3 weeks, it's not usually that good, especially when you've never done it before. But one of the beautiful things about not knowing any of the rules is you can break all the rules and somehow it might just work. And that was Dead on Demand, and that was the first book in my DCI Morton series, and the 10th one is coming out in January. So,
okay, wow. So you've been writing you said it started in 2012, right?
Yep.
So about a book a year, or have you kind of just been all over the place with it?
Yeah, pretty much a book a year. Some of them have been a bit quicker, some have been a bit slower, but I've aimed to do one a year. I cheated 1 year and did a sort of novella. This last one's taken me nearly 18 months, so hopefully it's worth it, but we'll see.
And what did you win for the bet? Was it at least a pint?
Yeah, it was a couple of pints.
All right, good. So I will have to say you are the first non-American that I've had on, so welcome. We're probably going to have to get subtitles for you or something because, I don't know if anybody can understand you with that thick accent you have.
Probably not, but we'll give it a go.
So had you had any desire to do any writing before this, or was this kind of just a slap in the face and then you found out that you loved it?
To be honest, I just didn't expect it to be something that was potentially viable as a career. That you always hear about impoverished authors, and the average book sales stats are tiny. Most people sell a few hundred copies if they're lucky. And there was some awful statistic that came out of a Penguin Random House lawsuit a few months ago that said that half their books were selling, I think it reported something like 10 copies or less, which is just insane. You think you spend a year doing something, you've got thousands of pounds worth of editing and art and all the rest of it that goes into turning your raw manuscript into a finished book. And by those numbers, it really shouldn't work. And yet Kindle sort of democratized being a novelist in that you could suddenly bypass all the middlemen and keep 70% of the money, which meant that the first year Dead on Demand was out, I had a free run where I got to #1 in the free charts, and in 5 days I gave away 55,800 odd copies of the book, and from then on people read it, and they read the sequel, and they read the next one and the next one, and sometimes just going direct to market, as it were, allows you to connect with readers that would otherwise completely ignore you.
That's awesome. So we'll get into a little bit about your publishing journey later on, but would you say that you write full-time right now, or do you have like another job and this is your side gig, or is that your side gig?
No, the writing has been my full-time gig now for 9 years. So,
wow, that is awesome. You're my model. I aspire to be you.
Well, it doesn't pay as well.
So what are? Oh, I'm sorry. What was that?
It doesn't pay as well as you might like, but it's nice enough.
Yeah, but if you can do what you love, they say you never work a day in your life, right?
It's a lie. It's a lie. There's some bits of it you love. I mean, and you know what it's like writing. That some days you think it's brilliant and you're really talented and you've got confidence in your own stuff, and then 10 minutes later you reread it and you're like, why did I write this? What was the point? And then they come back to
I've done that with run-on sentences.
Exactly.
So what are some of your favorite books, and how do you draw inspiration from them in your own writing?
So I love a lot of crime novels, obviously. So there's a very talented friend of mine, a guy called Abir Mukherjee, and he writes what's basically tartan noir set in India. So he's an Indian guy with a Scottish accent, which, if you get him on, you won't understand a word he's saying. And he writes about Calcutta, about 100 years ago, historical crime, and I love the fact that he puts so much sort of the place and the sense of time into the book. And I think you need to do one thing really well in order to succeed. And either you've got to have great characters, or you've got to have great setting, or you've got to have great murders. Ideally, obviously, you want to do all of them. But people tend to be very, very good at one thing. And I tend to read different authors for different reasons. So I read Abir stuff Not because he lived upstairs from me for a few years and he gave me a free copy, but because he's very, very good. And then, of course, you've got people like Michael Connolly, the stuff which obviously you've heard of, and you've got super tight plots with great characters. And I just love seeing a really cleverly put together novel where you don't see everything coming, where there's lots of details that are extraneous that appear to be completely unrelated, and suddenly the whole thing gets reframed towards the end. And that's my favourite sort of fiction, is sort of a puzzle within a book.
Okay. Awesome. So why do you choose, and you chose crime for your genre of choice, I'll say. So is there a reason that you chose that specifically, or is that kind of what you know? Not I'm calling you a criminal. If you want to admit anything, we can delete the tape after, but...
Well, I trained as a lawyer, so I'm going to say no, I'm not a criminal. But I would say that whether I was or not, so, I've always been interested in crime because I think it's the least literary of genres in that it's considered, commercial fiction, and yet you can have very strong literary elements. That the murder can be something as brutal and gory as just blood and a knife, or it can be the complexity of characters who are driven and pushed past their limits and do terrible things in terrible circumstances. And so you can have a layer of complexity that goes behind all of the clever story that goes with the puzzle, and then you've got all the procedure and the law, which obviously I know a bit about, and you can sort of meld it all together to come up with something that's quite sort of, well, fascinating, really. I mean, I think that for some people, reading crime is the blood and guts of it, and sometimes it's the murder and the fascination. Sometimes it's vicariously experiencing violence. Sometimes it's about the puzzle. But for me, it's about the restoration of law and order towards the end. That you have this horrible circumstance at the start of the book. It often gets worse throughout, and you think, how could you possibly fix this? And then you see how sort of the detectives try and fix things. They don't always have the answers. The bad guy doesn't always get caught. They don't always get punished appropriately. But it's sort of quite comforting to know that there is a procedure behind the law that will respond in the worst circumstances. And I quite like the dynamics behind that, and the people behind it are very human. You've got police detectives who are often confronted with horrible things and reacting with humour. I mean, a lot of police detectives I've met do come up with very dark jokes to try and lighten their day when they're dealing with stuff that's awful and horrendous and PTSD inducing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think crime novels are inarguably very popular. There's the running joke of all the women love going and watching all their murder shows at night and stuff. And my wife is no exception, I'll say that. But going back to, you said that you were trained as a lawyer. Did you do criminal law, or give me a little bit of insight into that?
No, I didn't do criminal law at all, which is quite perverse because I wanted to do sort of commercial stuff. I ended up not doing it to go and look after my mum because she was ill. And that was one of the reasons I had time to write the first book. So I'm sort of an accidental novelist, as it were. But yeah, I do know a bit about criminal law. I had to study it when I was called to the bar. So naturally that sort of imbues the procedure with an air of authenticity, even though it's not necessarily my direct specialism, but you still have to cover everything here. To train as a barrister in the UK, you have to do all of the different areas of practice. So sort of a third of what we did at postgraduate would have been criminal law. So although I've never done anything to do with criminal law whatsoever, I can tell you all about the international shipping rules if you like, but probably not very interesting. But one of the benefits of it is that I had a copy of a book called Smith and Hogan, which is like the criminal law textbook, or was 10 years ago, and it had thousands and thousands of criminal cases in it. And reading an awful lot of them in order to qualify meant that I've read a lot of real life murders, and they are overwhelmingly pedestrian. But there's always a human story behind it. And for crime fiction to work, you need to take something that's grounded in reality and then make it far more interesting, much bigger. There are very few serial killers in real life, and yet if you read crime fiction, you'd think there was a serial killer hiding on every corner, waiting to jump out at you, murder the next three people, and then go on a massive killing spree around the corner. Because we're fascinated with them for some reason. Just that, as soon as you say Jeffrey Dahmer or one of the real life serial killers, you see Netflix make a documentary about them, that somehow they're notorious, and you end up with a huge amount of fascination into what they've done and why, and that translates to the crime fiction. I mean, you mentioned that women watch a lot of crime fiction, and overwhelmingly women are the readers for crime novels as well. I've had a look at sort of some of my Facebook stats and all the rest of it from time to time, or look at my mailing list, and you'll see that there's a lot of women's names, a lot of women in their 40s, 50s, 60s are quite commonly crime readers. So it's an interesting demographic, and it's curious to me why that is, because I think crime should be interesting for everyone, but it's just a bit different.
Well, I actually have a comment about that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson. He's a modern philosopher, you could say. And I'm deeply paraphrasing him right now, but he said, we tell stories so that we can prepare ourselves for an event in the future that may or may not come, but that way we understand how to react when those things happen to us. So perhaps a lot of women feel very vulnerable or threatened in their lives, and so they read these novels to understand how the characters react in those situations, so they could in turn know how to react if they were ever in that situation. Just food for thought.
That's interesting. I mean, women are overwhelmingly victims of crime. Apart from in prisons, where obviously men, on the other hand, flip the switch, and men are massively victims of crime in prisons. But for day to day, I don't know about you, but when I walk around the streets of London, I feel relatively safe, even when it's after dark, even in places that are, less savoury than others. And yet, if I were a woman, if I were 5 foot tall rather than 6'3", I think I might feel a bit more vulnerable. And you can see how you'd want to explore that in a safe way. And I think you've got a fantastic point there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. I've never finished a crime novel, though I did start one time. I was actually reading it the other day, and it was pretty good, if I say so myself. And it's actually based on a true story of someone that I knew, and his wife was murdered by his mother-in-law. So her own mother ended up killing her, and without revealing everything. And this is actually a true court case, and I read like 900 pages of court manuscript to try and put this together, and maybe it'll be out someday, but it's very fascinating to read all that stuff and then in your own mind put together the story of what might have happened in real life that led to all these events, and you're reading these witness testimonies, and it's interesting to put all that in like a more palatable form so a reader could read it and envision it instead of just seeing words that are said in a court and then recorded.
Yeah.
Have you done any court manuscript research?
Yeah, I occasionally do. I find it's quite interesting to look at witnesses and how unreliable they are. And that you'll see someone describe one scene, and then if you ask them to describe the same scene the next night, they'll give you a different answer. And the human brain is incredibly capable of creating false memories. We're really bad at remembering details. We're quite good at convincing ourselves that we do remember things by telling ourselves the story over and over and over again. But if you've seen like the viral videos of the dancing gorilla, where people are asked to count the balls going left to right on the screen, and while they do that, they concentrate on one thing and they miss the fact there's a dancing gorilla going back and forth across the screen. And that went viral years ago for a reason, that people are very capable of honing in on one detail at a time, or remembering when something took place, but not the details of where, or they overestimate how much they could see from where they were. I mean, if you went to a random person and said, what were you doing at 9 o'clock last Thursday? Some people might remember exactly what they were doing. Others might sort of try and work it out from what they were doing the rest of the day. Oh, well, I finished work at 6. My wife cooked me dinner at 7, and then at 9 o'clock I went to this and that and the other. But it's very rare for someone to go, yeah, at 9:05, that was when I was 300 meters up the mountain over there. And if the further back you go, it gets more and more ridiculous. If I said, what were you doing on the 3rd of May last year? Unless that happened to be a special date or you're on holiday, chances are you're going to want to look in your calendar at the very least and see what your appointments you might have had that day. But maybe you just don't remember anything. And it's such a strong question in many crime dramas on TV that you see the detective comes in and goes, where were you on Thursday the 3rd of June? I have no idea. And the truth is, you can't remember most of the details. That we connect to things that are very strongly emotional, and unless you were part of the event and therefore have a strong emotional connection to it, you're much less likely to have a strong memory of anything. I mean, if you just walk past something, could you describe 3 people that you walked past in the street yesterday? Probably not. Could you describe someone that punched you in the face and ran off with your wallet? Maybe. But at the same time, you're probably going to be quite distracted by the fact you're in a lot of pain because someone's punched you in the face, and more annoyed that they've run off with your wallet. And it's probably quite quick. I mean, muggings tend to be very, very quick. London's going through a spate of moped robberies at the minute, where people are coming up on mopeds, wearing helmets, quite anonymous, snatching phones and driving off. It's a very quick very effective way of robbing someone, and people do sort of bury their heads in the phone. So you make yourself a target a bit in that way. And if you said, "Could you tell me what that person looked like?" You can go, "Well, they've got a bike." Okay, so they've got a bike. That's good. What else? Nothing. You're not going to remember anything, are you? You're not going to have seen anything under their helmet. You're not going to remember which way they went, other than maybe that way. But you're not going to know that they turned right 3 roads over and then did a loop back and robbed someone else 10 yards from where you were standing an hour later. And so trying to put that and marry it up with the forensics, which tend to be far more exacting, although subject to the CSI effect where we sort of over-rely on them. Because one of the things that I find with my research is that when you speak to people who've done forensics, it's incredibly expensive. And that's one of the things you never hear about on telly. That, for example, I'm writing at the moment about a killer who has not got their DNA in the UK's national database because you have to be arrested in order to have your DNA taken here. But there could be a sibling match or a familial match in some way, and you can find fathers, sons, siblings, daughters. But that test is potentially expensive, and it doesn't necessarily get you straight to the person, so often it isn't carried out. And sometimes what we see is that the evidence is examined in a very cursory way. It's stored, bagged, tagged, and kept for later, but it's not necessarily processed exhaustively. So you might do a DNA sample on the floor, you might look for blood, but you're not necessarily going to do trace fibre analysis, which is notoriously expensive, where you look for trace particles of fibres that have transferred. So if someone wearing gloves, there might be transfer fibres from those gloves to whatever they've touched. But you're not going to do that sort of test because it's incredibly expensive, and police budgets are incredibly small relative to the amount of work they have to do. And so if you can marry that up and try and take some of the contextual details, some of the witness details, all that stuff you see in court transcripts, because you're going to see huge amounts of information, and you're going to see experts who've got one opinion, and you're going to see opposing experts who've got the exact opposite opinion. The US especially, I understand, is quite notorious for experts who are sort of guns for hire, and that makes it very difficult. When one says black, one says white, everyone's going to assume grey, but really it could just be white, and that my expert was lying or mistaken or relying on one bit of evidence over another. And it's very, very easy to be incredibly convinced to then sort of reframe it later on when you realise that the evidence isn't quite as it was presented, or that there's a bit of countervailing evidence that says something completely different. But yeah, the court transcripts are just a start.
So what you're telling me is that being a criminal is a possibly lucrative career with low chance of getting caught.
Yeah, just get a bike. Get a bike. You probably want to get not an iPhone, because I understand you can track those quite well, but if you could nick Samsungs and all the rest of it, get them out of the country so the IMEI is not blocked. And don't hire me as a lawyer, because obviously I know nothing.
So obviously there's a huge marketplace for crime novels right now. What makes your writing unique?
I think it's partly the sense of place. I mean, London is a big place, and lots of people have set books here. But I love London, and a lot of the places that are in my novels are places I've lived, I've worked, places that I know quite well. I don't put a location in unless I've been there. I tend to take a lot of photos of the places that I go and look at, and I visit multiple times a day. Obviously, Google in Maps is very useful for doing sort of preliminary work, and then going to have a look at it in person, and that's quite useful. And the second thing I think I do reasonably well, if I may say so myself, is the puzzle element of it. That I tend to have multi-layered puzzles that you're probably not going to work out what the ending is. So, for example, at the moment, the book I've got coming out in January is called Murdered by the Mob, and that one's about a guy who was a former mobster recruited as a child soldier, and decades later he's sort of come to terms with his past behaviour in the gang, and he's very angry about someone's death and wants revenge. Unfortunately, all those involved have either gone into hiding because they're criminals on the run, or they're in the UK's version of the Witness Protection Programme because they turned Queen's evidence. And how do you find all the people that are protected witnesses and the people that they may know where they are? And I think that's quite difficult. And if you can work out how to break witness protection, I think you're doing quite well. So one of the things you might have seen is a TV show in the UK called Hunted, which is a programme where everyday people are invited to go on the run, and a fake police team try and catch them. And usually they're caught in days, because these are people that decide they're going to go to their mum or dad's house and sleep in the lounge. And obviously the hunters go and find them very quickly. It's quite good television, if a little bit predictable. But one of the common things is people tend to go back to locations they know and people tend to go back to family they know. And even if you can avoid all the locations you know and all the family you know, you can't change your personality overnight. I mean, if you're a massive rugby fan right now and you go into witness protection, you're not going to suddenly become a cricket fan. You know, you can't change all of the core parts of your personality, and so there will always be a connection to your old life, and I think that's fascinating. And then if you can find that and play on that, and I should say that UK's witness protection program people, which is UK PPS, have never lost a witness ever, so they're probably better than I'm giving them credit for here. But if you can sort of follow the logic that people do have a connection and they can't change themselves, if you put enough time, enough money, and enough effort and resources into it, you should, in theory, be able to find them. And if you can find them, then presumably you can do something with that if you're a serial killer hell-bent on revenge against the person who's killed someone you love. And I think that's quite an interesting way of doing it. And then if you layer on top of that unique murder methodologies, ones that haven't been done before. So famously, there's concrete boots, started out as a fiction murder method. You know, put some people into a block of concrete, throw them in the river and they drown. That one started in fiction. I think it has been done once in real life. It's not a good way of killing people. If you look at the things in court transcripts, you'll see it's far more common that someone will be murdered, wrapped in chicken wire and then thrown into a body of water so that their body sinks. That happens an awful lot, whereas the sort of concrete boots approach doesn't. So what I tend to do is try and find really twisted people. And a friend of mine is trained as a psychiatrist and is very, very clever. And we were discussing unique ways of killing people. And he joked about the dangers of an MRI machine. So an MRI machine, big magnet. If you go in there and you've got any metal in you, it's going to tear you apart, basically. And so the murder method we came up with that day, which ended up into, I think, my fourth or fifth book, knock someone out over the back of the head with ball bearings, with a brick, put ball bearings inside them, take them to the edge of the cameras near a major hospital, and wait until the paramedics come and help. And tell them he's got a head injury. Paramedics take the victim, full of ball bearings, in for it with a head injury. First thing they have to do with someone who's got a head injury is to check them out by putting them in the MRI machine. You put someone full of ball bearings in the MRI machine, turn the big magnet on, boom. You've just blown your victim up from the inside. So if you can do a unique murder methodology, I think you can add an extra layer there. And if you can do that on top of characters who are compelling and interesting and have a reason to want to kill someone, and make sure that you're doing it in a setting that's interesting, and you can line all that up, I think it can elevate crime fiction from being very much a genre fiction, cookie cutter formula to something that's quite interesting and, dare I say, a little bit more literary than you might expect.
Yeah. Well, that I've never heard of that murder method before, so, congrats to you and your friend for inventing that.
We did a few for that book. I think we had 6 completely unique murder methods in one book, which I should have really spread out over 6 books, but I'm an idiot and don't care. So,
So I understand you have a series. Is it all from the point of view of one character, like a detective or something like that, or outline that for me a little bit?
I tend to use a split perspective. I don't stick with one approach for all the books. The detective is common throughout, DCI Morton, so you've got a sort of older, mid-50s detective. He likes to joke that he's a genius, but really he's just got a lot of experience. He's acting on hunches most of the time. He's sort of the dogged police detective type. He's not particularly brilliant. He's just reasonably smart enough to sort of evaluate things in the same way you or I might. And in that way, he's sort of a reader stand-in that you can see he's doing things you could plausibly do if you were in his shoes. He's not the genius that solves it magically. He's not the Holmes type. He jokes he's got a perfect memory, but of course that doesn't actually exist. So you've got someone who's in there as a reader insert, and then I occasionally change the perspective to that of the killer to show what they're doing, how they're doing it. And in that way, you've got a bit of suspense, because you've ever had that joke about if there's a bomb going off and it's under the table, the bomb goes off, it's not very interesting, even though it is dramatic. But if you've got 2 characters sitting having a very mundane conversation, also not very interesting, but take the mundane conversation and take the bomb and put a timer on it, and the reader knows there's a ticking time bomb underneath the table, but the characters don't, suddenly you've created a hell of a lot more dramatic tension just from having that extra perspective. And so by putting the killer's perspective in there, sometimes it's really interesting because you see that sword of Damocles hanging over the victims, hanging over the detectives, and you can see what you think they might be about to do. And so you can sort of see, if I were the killer, what would I do? I mean, you can ignore the morality side of it. It's just if you take it as read that you're going to kill this person, that it's justified, that it's fair, and that you're in the killer's shoes, and it comes down to how would you do it, suddenly you've got the questions of logistics there and murder methods, and it's surprising how many people, if you ask them how would you kill someone, that they actually do have an idea in their head. I'm always a little bit scared when people come up with very elaborate answers off the bat. When they go, how are you going to kill someone? You expect them to say shooting, stabbing. They're like, no, well, I'm going to get an anaconda and I'm going to milk it for venom and then I'm going to mix this into... No, shut up. If you've actually killed someone, don't tell me.
So going back to your style a little bit, you said you have the split perspective and you have the perpetrator, doing the murder. Does the reader know who that is, or is it just a figure? And do you leave enough clues that someone might be able to actually piece it together, or is it something that the character has to figure out?
Yeah, you should be able to work it out. Sometimes I have had readers email saying they worked it out on page 1. And I've even had people say they worked out what was going to happen at the end from the title, which I'm always impressed by. So I try to put clues in things all the way through. Occasionally I'll have a sort of prologue set up where you've got the protagonist who's the killer, but we don't know much about the victim. So you've just got the sort of, if you've seen Law and Order, where they show you the body at the start and then work backwards to show you what the police are doing to solve that murder. Sometimes you get a flash of what's going on at the start. Other times it's more reactive. Last year I did a book called The Grifter, which was about a guy who ended up homeless after an injury in the workplace. He was an electrician. There was a spark injury that caused him to lose his leg. He won a load of compensation, which should have been the money that he used to pay for all of his medical supplies, all his needs for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, he invested it with a fraudster running a Ponzi scheme without knowing. And you can see how that quickly spirals to him being on the streets. And then he wants revenge against the fraudster. And that one was really interesting because the two perspectives are the guy trying to kill the fraudster and the fraudster himself running the Ponzi scheme, which is unravelling because obviously Ponzi schemes eventually are very much likely to unravel. I mean, in theory, you can keep them going on forever. Madoff almost did that. But it's quite interesting because that one, you've got two guys, both of whom are criminals, and both of whom are attempting to do things that are quite terrible. And yet I've had people say that they sympathise with the stresses of a collapsing Ponzi scheme, which is not something you'd expect from a reader, that they've just enjoyed seeing the guy try and struggle. And he's got his own struggles. That he's dealing with money on one scheme that he's trying to rob Peter to pay Paul because the Ponzi scheme is collapsing. And at the other end of the scale, you've got a guy who's homeless who's struggling to get enough money to buy a sandwich because he's got nothing and he wants, the most basic of things. And so you've almost got Maslow's hierarchy of needs in inverse. So you've got one guy who's starting at the very top and should be reaching for self-actualization, and he's slowly losing everything that matters to him, working his way down because his scheme's coming to an end, and the other guy's trying to work his way out of the gutter, starting with basic things like food and security and then working up to human connection and all the rest of it. And so having two evil perspectives in that one allows you to see that, given the right circumstances, quite a lot of people, not necessarily everyone, are capable of doing things that are illegal. And it's interesting that some people rooted for the more objectively bad guy who's been screwing over lots of people with his fraud scheme, whereas others were rooting for the homeless protagonist who just wanted to get his own back as well as you can as a homeless person on the streets of London, facing against a billionaire Ponzi scheme activist who's running the biggest fraud in history.
Uh-huh.
Bit of a David versus Goliath of criminal on criminal.
Yeah, and I think that is a mark of a good plot, is when the reader doesn't necessarily know who to vote for. Like in a lot of stories, there's black and there's white, there's good and there's evil, and you're like, okay, this is truly the good and truly the evil, and I want the good guys to win. But I am also a fan of morally ambiguous landscapes, as some people might say it. That's actually a good transition into my next question, which is, you seem to have a lot of really good ideas for plots, and you use a lot of what I would say like motifs running through your stories. Did you have any sort of formal writing training, or did you do research as you became an author, or how did you get this skill set?
So it was completely off the cuff to begin with. As I said, I broke all the rules. I did nothing according to how you should. Everyone says to start with a 3-act structure. It's the most obvious way to structure things. You might look at Campbell's hero's journey. You've got lots of archetypes that are quite useful. For me, the first book I did, Dead on Demand, had 6 perspectives, in that they're almost vignettes of people who all wanted to commit murder, and all of them couldn't kill their own victim, and so you've got essentially a murder swap on the internet. That there's a guy who's trying to kill his wife, and he kicks it all off by trying to find someone else to swap murders with. Except for he's a coward who wants to try and close it off so he doesn't have to commit murder. So he finds a third person to swap with the second one, a fourth person quick with the third. So he's trying to distance himself enough that the chain is so daisy-chained and long that nobody could ever work their way back along it to find him. And so if you've got that sort of plot structure, it is a mess. It is incredibly complicated. And you've got so many perspectives with so many victims, so many witnesses, so many crime scenes that it is incredibly quick. And the only constant is a detective who, interleaved among all those criminals, is trying to work out what the hell is going on and has no idea because there are bodies dropping dead left and right. And can bodies drop dead? People dropping dead. Bodies appearing all over the show, left, right and centre. And there's nothing to connect them because they've been killed as a part of a murder swap or a network of murder swaps organised on the darknet. So everything's very much happening in the shadows. And if you're a detective who normally investigates, armed robberies, domestic violence, hit and runs, and suddenly you're confronted with people dying for literally no apparent reason because there's nothing connecting the killer and the victim other than the intermediary, it's very difficult to solve that sort of story. And so I started with very unorthodox story structures. I've kind of stuck with very unorthodox structures. Like I said, the last one last year, having two bad guys with alternate points of view in slightly different timelines with a slight bit of unreliability thrown in there just to mess things up. It's not the sort of thing you would be expected to do. Whereas some of my other stuff, I have tried to be a bit more traditional. Cleaver Square, my second book, was very much the bodies found, police are investigating, here's how it happened. A little bit closer, sort of the golden age of fiction. And it took me a lot longer because there's, I think, constraints in working to the expected story structure. Sometimes it's a really good way to take something that's a complete mess and sort of mould it into a more manageable story. But sometimes you take an original, interesting spark and you crush it by putting too many expectations. There are some genres that you have to stick to formulas, romance being the notorious example. If you look at Harlequin books, they're romance novels, they have very, very sort of strong rules about what has to happen. On page 32, the main character must kiss their thing, there must be this, that and the other. And it's so structured. And I don't want to write within the constraints of that sort of structure. I know it's a very profitable way to do it because you can do it quickly because you're basically telling the same story over and over and over again. But I think readers deserve better than that. If they're going to pay you for a new book each time, they deserve to have something that is truly unique and original. And if you can come up with an original idea and you can execute it well, hopefully that sort of book will have much more longevity. That you might not make as much as churning out 12 books a year with the same story, but I think it's truer to the sort of artistic vision of being an author, because most authors are not in this for the money. They're in it for the enjoyment of being a creative, and the money is just the necessary evil to pay for the roof over the head, the electricity, the food, so you can carry on doing that.
Yeah, it's true. We got the two sides of us, like you said, the necessary evil, quote unquote, of money, but then the artist within all of us who we have a story that we want to tell, we want to be heard. One of my favorite quotes, and I forget who said it, but it says, "Writing is an act of ego." And it's like almost to say what's going on in my head is so important that I have to write it down so everyone else can know what's going on in my head.
It is pretty arrogant, isn't it? It's not only that I'm going to waste a year writing all these words and putting them into a Word document, but I'm going to expect you to spend 10 hours reading it. I mean, to expect complete strangers to give me money for a Word document and then spend 10 hours of their life. I mean, if you take the thousands and thousands of people that read your book and add it up, we are talking about thousands of human years being spent reading books. I mean, at this point, my books have been downloaded 8 or 9 million times in total across all formats. And if you then say that the average person takes 10 hours to read that, you get suddenly 90 million hours of reading time. That's several human lifetimes being spent reading stuff that you've created. I mean, you have to be an incredibly massive prick to think my books are good enough to deserve that.
Well, you fit the bill, so.
Exactly. I mean, I was destined to do it. I mean, I had to, practice law or write books, and unfortunately for the world, I tried both. So murder was more fun.
So going back to some of the ideas that you have for these murders, they're very gruesome, it seems like. Would you say that you have that it's affected your personality at all if you're constantly thinking about these ways to murder people, or do you kind of already have that dark side that you're just letting out?
To be honest, it's quite hard to come up with the murder mystery methods, especially when you want to do something that's really original. And it does take me a long time to come up with something that I haven't done before. It's annoying when you read something new in the charts and you're like, oh, I should have thought of that. Because original murder methods just don't come up very often. Most murders are guns, stabbings, poisonings. People shoot people, people strangle people, people hit people, people run over people. They don't tend to, find an obscure way to kill. Or if they do, we don't hear about it. And I think that's one of the sort of scary things about the real world is that if there are these super intelligent, hyper capable serial killers out there, we're never ever going to hear about it because they're the ones that don't get caught. And by definition, the ones in books have to get caught by the end of it because otherwise all you've got is a serial killer's diary about how they've killed 3 people this week and they're going to do put 2 more in next week. And that doesn't work for crime fiction. I mean, maybe actually it would, but actually that could be quite good. Would you read that?
You just got a new idea here.
There we go. It does. It sort of comes from nowhere, doesn't it? They always say that a thesis and antithesis and the synthesis of 2 ideas brings out new ideas, and I think that's kind of what you're trying to do as a novelist. Is you take old things and put a new spin on them, and you keep spinning those ideas and mixing them up and coming up with something slightly different. So you go, well, I've got a gun. Oh no, we don't want to shoot someone. It's boring. What if I had a 3D printed gun? Okay, slightly better. That's been done. 3D printed guns have got lots of limitations. They're short range, so you have to get very, very close. And if someone sees you coming up to them with a plastic gun, they're going to at least be somewhat suspicious. So what do we do with our 3D plastic printed gun? We hide it. So we go, well, what could we hide it in? Because they yay big. The barrel's quite large. If you've seen there are diagrams of 3D printed guns freely available on the internet if you know where to look, and criminals presumably would. So we take that 3D printed gun and we go, we're going to hide it in a digital single lens reflex camera because they've got nice big lenses. And then you go, well, you've got that nice lens there that's got a mirror finish on the front so you can't see what's on inside until it's too late. You've got a reason to get up and close because you're just a tourist wandering around London with a camera. And actually you're a guy with a single-use printed gun hidden inside a camera who can walk around London carrying this 3D printed gun in a camera case. No one's going to look at you. Suddenly you've got a brand new murder methodology. You just have to put a twist on it. Everything has to be mixed up and changed in order to be interesting. If you just said, I'm going to go and shoot that guy in an alleyway, not interesting. A 3D printed gun, hide it in a camera, walk down the streets, follow the guy into the alleyway, he thinks I'm just lost, boom, dead, short range, ditch it all. And nobody's going to be looking for that as the police. You're not going to go, well, this guy's got a gun. You're going to go, where's the gun? You're going to think there's a Smith & Wesson thrown in the Thames. You're not going to think the guy's got a 3D printed gun, quick look around for cameras. And so by upping the stakes like that and doing things that are more interesting on the murder side, you suddenly have an even more interesting police side because all of the forensics they're looking at don't line up to your typical expectations of a murder. And so the police have to up the game. And then you've got really interesting police characters who look at that sort of thing. And suddenly you're bringing in police experts who might look at 3D printing, they might look at digital forensics, they might look at all the trace fibers, DNA. You've got to try and sort of meld all those traditional techniques and then work out what would they do next. And then you've got to sort of marry that up against police procedure and budgets and all the rest of it because you've got to temper everything with a bit of reality. So you want to do stuff that could be done, but not necessarily stuff that has been done. And that, I think, is a really tight rope to walk as a crime novelist. It's got to be plausible, but equally, some of your best ideas, the ones that are really, really clever, the ones that you wouldn't be able to catch yourself. And so you can't write the crime side and the police side. And I think there is a slight danger that if you come up with a really clever idea and you put it in a book, that someone might then go and actually use it. There's a sort of weight of responsibility there. I mean, I'm not sure serial killers are really fishing through the crime aisle on Amazon to look for something. I mean, that would be an interesting world in which they were, but it's a possibility. I mean,
it's a possibility, yeah.
Another book.
It's a weight of responsibility over your head for sure. All right, well, let's try and get you out of here in a couple minutes. Let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about your writing habits. So what is it like for a full-time author to write every day?
So I don't write every single day. Some of the days I will be doing research. I like to go out and visit locations, as I said. I like to speak to experts. So I will try and speak to police detectives. I try and speak to criminal lawyers. I try and speak to psychiatrists. I try and speak to people who've done virtual autopsies. I try and follow some of the academia, so that I will read forensic journals, all the rest, in order to try and get ideas there. I'd say that 4 months of the year for me is research and nothing but research. So if I get stuck and I can't think of anything that's interesting, that might be as simple as what is everyone else doing. So I'll read the charts, I'll see what crime novels are out there. I'll read stuff that's not crime, because ultimately character development can be learned from any genre. I'll watch things on Netflix. There's going to be a lot of documentaries. And I'm quite holistic about trying to sort of mix up the dry academic accurate stuff with the really character driven stuff. And then ideally I then try and write the book in sort of 6 months of the year, between first draft edits and all the rest of it, and then 2 months of the year, roughly, not all in one chunk, but spread out throughout, will be allocated to the business of writing. So that's the marketing, it's doing podcasts, it's selling subsidiary rights, so just managing, selling audio rights to publishers, things that bring in extra money, because that is important. Is if you want to be able to write full time, you need to be able to keep bringing in enough cash to do that. And subsidiary rights, because copyright is an incredibly sort of versatile thing. You think, oh, I've got a book, but really what you've got is the copyright in a book, and you can license chunks of it. So you might sell rights to the Italian translation, you might sell Chinese rights, you might sell audio rights, you might sell dramatic and fiction rights, you might sell movie rights, and you could, sometimes those are options, sometimes those are outright productions, and the terms on which you sell them can be time limited, they can be geographically limited, and so there's an awful lot that goes on behind the scenes there. And as a lot of my stuff is self-published, I also spend a lot of time managing contractors, so artists, branding designers, hiring ads managers and running ads across pay-per-click campaigns. There's a lot of business stuff going on in the background. That you're not just, if you're self-publishing at least, you're an author and you're a publisher. And if you're not self-publishing, you're probably still your own publicist, and so you're going to do a lot of stuff to try and promote books, because if you don't tell anyone a book exists, nobody buys it and you make no money. So you have that necessary evil that you keep coming back to, that you have to write the book, edit the book, put the book out, start planning the next book, and while you're mixing all that up, you're trying to have a life, and you're trying to push the book and trying to sort of create that long funnel of readers trying your first book, loving it, and reading all of them. And the more books you've got out, the easier it gets, because ultimately, when you're pushing one book at first, it's incredibly difficult because the volume just isn't there. And then by the time you've got 10 books, you only have to sell to 10% of the readers, but you've got far more little adverts, even on Amazon in the also boughts. You've got your cover will appear next to other books that are similar to yours that readers have bought, and suddenly having more books is just an incredibly valuable way of taking up digital real estate, because it's not a publishing problem, it's a discoverability problem now. And that's part of the democratization of books, is that now anyone can publish a book. What a book is or isn't is now incredibly loosely defined. You can put a short story up and call it an ebook, and it is an ebook. It's not what we would consider a book traditionally. We might have called it a novelette, we might have called it a short story, but now you look on Amazon and there's going to be 30-40 million books to choose from, and you don't know about 39.9 million of them because they are invisible, because you can't find them. Whereas the ones that are in the charts do move, and you end up with this sort of extreme in publishing, in that you're either doing very, very well at any moment or you're doing really badly. And so that can be a bit stressful, because you're trying to plan your next hit, because it's so hits driven that when you release a new book, you shoot that into the charts because you get a load of pre-orders, all your day one fans come in, all the people on your newsletters, your mailing lists, and your Facebook fans, your Twitter fans, give you a nice bump initially. And if it doesn't sort of go sort of viral organically straight out the gate, you've got to put a lot of ads behind it to keep that going, and then slowly it trails off. And my rule of thumb is that if it does X amount in the first month, you can expect to lose a third of that in the second month, another third in the third month, and so you end up with very, very large peaks followed by massive drops. And it's incredibly hits driven, in that if you don't publish consistently, quickly, and the slower you are as an author, the harder it is to do all that stuff in 2 months that makes it work. And then you get stressed, and stressed writers tend to be slower, they tend to not come up with as much stuff. It's really hard to be creative when you're stressed. Everyone I know that in lockdown, because we had very harsh lockdowns in the UK, especially in London, where we had this horrible tier system last Christmas, and you end up seeing people burn out because they're trying so hard to write the next book because they have to, because that's the only way they can stay in the game, and then what they write is rubbish because they're forcing it, because it has to be quicker than it should be. Because coming up with the original stuff is so much harder than churning out old ideas done a second time. So it's just a bit of a sort of a wrestle, the tension.
Yeah, it sounds to me like people, when they say, "Hey, I want to be an author," they have this vision of sitting on the beach drinking a mimosa, scratching notes on a notepad. When in reality, what you've described to me is a very entrepreneurial journey. You're not only being a creative, but then you're marketing yourself, and you're, like you said, finding partners for the different rights, and then trying to manage and maintain social media. It seems like there's a whole scale of things that you have to do,
You have
more
got
than
to, yeah,
just being an author.
exactly.
I'm sorry, what was that?
It's wearing every hat. You're doing every job
Yeah.
all the time. You're your own publicist, your own marketing manager, your own accountant, maybe. You're doing your own legal compliance stuff. So you have to be able to do everything and not drop the
Yeah.
ball. It's spinning plates all the time. And it's a small business.
Now, you mentioned briefly publishers. Have you gone through any traditional publishers?
I have. So, for example, we had rights sales for audio sold to WF Howes for the series a couple of years back. And I don't hate publishers. I just want it to be a fair deal. So I always tell people to think very carefully about anything they sign, because ultimately it's very hard to get the rights back. It'll probably cost you a lot of money, it'll take a lot of time, and it's really hard to sort of let go of the control. When you're used to trying to manage everything yourself, and then you have to trust someone else to take over, it's incredibly stressful seeing them not do things as the way you would, and then if you don't get the results that you would have expected, you can see it quite frustrating. But one of the things that you can find with publishers is that they can do things that one author can't. And on the print side, they can get you into bookstores. For me, print books are a tiny percentage of what my books move. Most of mine are ebook. And going back to the deal I was just mentioning, WF Howes, was audio. And the reason I wanted to work with them was not that they were offering a big pile of money, because upfront it wasn't. It was a relatively small amount. But they have access to a star cast of narrators and actors that would never work with a random little author, but will work with the UK's biggest publishing house. So we ended up going through auditions on several narrators, actors, and they're all very, very good. The calibre was enormously high, and of course they're fronting all of the costs of that. So their cost up front is not only the amount they paid me, it's all the money they spent on the actor, and then all the post-production, and then they've got their own studios to record things. So they've got a lot of infrastructure that I don't have. And then they've got Findaway Voices and other distributor channels that they've got that I can't get access to as easily or in the right way. And we ended up with Jonathan Keeble, who's an Audie Award-winning narrator who did the book, and he did a fantastic job. And I'd never, ever have expected to be able to get the star narrator without going through a publisher. So I think you have to be willing to consider working with other people. It's just you have to be very sort of cautious about it, because there are lots of small presses that don't do anything that you can't do. They're digital first, and perhaps there's monetary considerations. They might have great editors. I mean, you need to work out what you're getting and what you're paying for it, and is it worth it? Because sometimes you might get a very short-term win of a bit of cash, but long-term you'll lose control, and ultimately publishers tend to be very frontlist focused, that they're looking for new, the great big next hit. They're not necessarily as interested in sort of weeding the garden and curating the backlist so that all the books you wrote 10 years ago are still going to earn you money. So as an author, you're reliant on selling the backlist, because the front list on its own is not going to make enough to pay the bills. So it's that tension between their commercial interests and yours, and trying to sort of, again, it's that delicate balancing act of what do you need right now and what's best short, medium and long term. And I'm a big fan of diversifying and saying, right, well, I'll try and sell some rights, but I won't sell them all. I'll try and keep the ones that I can exploit most lucratively. But at the same time, if someone else wants to pay for a star narrator and run adverts on their high margin indie trad book, while I make the benefit of that by bringing in readers who are willing to pay the higher prices of trad and then selling them indie books at a fifth of the price, they're very willing to pay it, because suddenly they're like, well, I know this guy. I've had one of his books from so and so. And I'm happy to pay $9.99. So when they see that the rest of my catalogue is available for $2.99, suddenly I look like a bargain, even though those later cheaper sales are much better on a sort of per unit basis. And so you've got to be a bit entrepreneurial again there, in that if you can use trad deals to get the foot in the door with new readers and then bring them to your indie backlist where you make enough money to pay the bills, I think that's the balance that's worth striking, because most of us are not going to be J.K. Rowling. We're not going to get the A-list celebrity treatment. Most people will get $5,000 advance and very little marketing and maybe a small print run, maybe no print run. Publishers are doing a lot of sort of digital first, digital only deals these days. Some of them are doing very, very low advances. And in those circumstances, it suddenly becomes a lot more marginal. Some people will value it just for the sort of prestige of being published by someone else. But at the same time, it's your rights, it's your baby, you spent years writing it, you should be the one that gets paid first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much for all of your insights into your series and your dark mind, as well as the publishing that you've been through. Any final comments before we wrap it up?
Well, all the books are available on Amazon, all the rest of it, links at dcimorton.com. Apart from that, thank you very much for having me.
Well, awesome. Thanks, Sean. Have a good one.
Cheers, and you.